Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the McLean County Museum of History. I am here to introduce Jack Keefe as he talks about his new book. Couple of notes before we start. This event is being live streamed. So at the Q&A portion, I'll say a little reminder, but just so you know, what you're saying will be on the internet. So just be aware of that. So our introduction here, Jack Keefe, a native of Bloomington. Jack Keefe was born at the Old St. Joseph Hospital and educated in the District 87 schools. He graduated from Bloomington High School and holds a degree from the Ohio State University in Columbus, and he's been fascinated by local history since childhood. He's worked as a journalist in print, TV, and radio beginning in 1966. He also worked as a realtor in Bloomington Normal from 1994 to 2017. Jack is known for writing the How Time Flies column in the Pantagraph from 2006 to 2022, and he publishes a local history newsletter called Back in the Day, and has another local history book in the works. Jack will be discussing his first book, Echoes of Purple and Gold, today. It's a collection of offbeat stories you may have never heard of before. It tells the stories of ordinary people. Echoes of Purple and Gold is Jack's first book, and it's for sale down in the Visitor Center. So after this presentation, we'll have a quick Q&A, and then we will go downstairs where Jack will be selling his book, and he'll be there signing it as well. So without further ado, Jack Keefe.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the McLean County Museum for making this presentation available, or making it possible, and to you for coming out today. It's a nice day outside. There's a lot of other things you could be doing, and I'm glad that you chose to be in here today. So, with the numbers we have seated here today, I think we can be pretty informal about Q&A after I do the spiel, and we won't rush anybody. So this book was a pleasure to research and pull the notes on. It was a real chore to write, and it was a real pain in the rear to publish. A lot of authors will tell you the same thing. So it was really hatched about, the first seed I guess was sown about 1988 when I became interested in the Purple and Gold story, which came from a one-line entry in my student manual in high school in the early 60s. So we'll get to that. It's the title of a chapter. And I've gotten a lot of comments about the picture on the cover, and you'll see how it's relevant. But first, already. It worked great in rehearsal, folks. There we go. First, the Ichabod Crane name should be familiar to everybody. Ichabod Crane, of course, was a storybook character created by Washington Irving. And there were really three Ichabod Cranes. First was the storybook character, and then there was this guy, Jesse Merwin. Irving modeled his Ichabod Crane on a real school teacher, and that was Mr. Merwin here. They were young men together. They went fishing together, hung around together, did young men things together. And he acknowledged several times during his life that Jesse Merwin was, in fact, the original of Ichabod Crane, as he put it. Jesse Merwin had several children, a whole bunch, 6 or 7. Two of his sons Asher and Clarence came west. And they settled in what was then Padua Township, east of Bloomington. First came Asher, and he had this real nice farm on what we think of now as East Oakland Avenue Road, out towards Padua. He established himself as a farmer there, and his brother Clarence came later. Clarence wasn't exactly a farmer. He was more of a businessman and an industrialist. And there was this little settlement not far away called Padua. So he got involved in all things Padua. Clerk in the general store, which he owned. He started a factory. He was the telegraph operator, and he had a phone going back to the 1880s. The Merwin brothers were around long enough to make an impact, but Asher eventually sold out and moved to Florida, and Clarence moved into town. It's from Clarence's genealogy that we get a lot of things around here that the Merwin family name is still attached to. The Merwin Gallery at Westland. The newspaper, the ownership of the Pantagraph for a long time was under Merwin control. And there we go. And so they had a big impact here. When Clarence died, even a newspaper in Kansas said, "The son of Ichabod Crane has passed away." So the phrase has been around for a long time. I said there was three. There was this guy. That's the real Ichabod Crane. I mean, he had a name, Ichabod Crane, and he had a career in the military. His son grew up to be a congressman from Ohio. He and Washington Irving actually met one time about 6 years before the Legend of Sleepy Hollow came out. And Washington Irving would later say, no, I really didn't name him after Ichabod Crane. So anyway, there's a lot of detail missing here because we're going to skim through the chapters. And the rest of the rest of what I know is in the book. Stare at that for a minute. I'm going to try to ease this cough a little bit. That's a quote. And that's a Magoon. John Magoon was a local do-gooder, and by that I mean a philanthropist, a guy who would give not his last nickel to anybody because he had lots and lots of money. He never met a dime he didn't like. And he would put it towards public good whenever he could. The quote comes from a charity auction or a charity rally where they were raising money for some cause or another. John Magoon is sitting back there, and he's a very bashful man. And he has some money to give, but he doesn't want to stand up and say, I give this amount. So he leans over to the guy next to him. The guy stands up, goes up to the guy running the rally, and he says, the guy running the rally shouts out, John Magoon, $1,000. Now, this is in the 1860s. It's quite a contribution. Would to God it would rain Magoons. So that's where the quote comes from. The only thing left of John Magoon these days is a street out in the Stevensville neighborhood near the Cargill plant. John Magoon became a silent partner in the Home Bank. The Home Bank was really right across the street, right over here. And it was run by Judge McLean, C.W.C. Munsell, who is one of the big wheels in the early days of Illinois Westland, and Charles W. Holder. Have you ever heard of the little town of Holder just to the east of here? He's the guy that laid it out. Magoon was a silent partner, so his name wasn't on the bank. Munsell, Holder, and McLean were good men, but they weren't really bankers, and eventually the bank went under. The last one to know about it was John Magoon. It's been argued ever since he died that the bank's failure really impacted his health, and he died early in 1878. One reason it really impacted his health was Magoon was the one that had all the money. He had to make good as far as he could on all of the debts where the bank was left holding the bag. The people like McLean and Holder had encumbered goods like land, and even if they disposed of them, it really wouldn't raise enough money to move the needle. He's been forgotten in local history, and I thought it would be nice to write a story about him. And so that's what we came up with. There's a lot more in the book. The good time come. Everybody knows what happens in this chapter. The railroads came, 1853. On the left, that's the Illinois Central, the way it was planned and the way it was originally built. One of the, about the eighth wonder of the world, they called it then, just because it was 700 miles of one railroad in the state of Illinois. They had a branch leading from the main line went from Cairo up through Freeport, Galena to Dunleith. Dunleith was the original name for East Dubuque. It was on the Mississippi River. The branch line broke off at Centralia, went up through Champaign, although Champaign wasn't there then, up to Chicago. And on a map, it looks like a tuning fork. The other line was the Chicago and Alton. The map on the right shows the way the Chicago and Alton looked after it was a little further developed. And both these lines arrived in 1853. The IC got here first, and then the Chicago and Alton did. The Illinois Central lasted probably long enough until it didn't quite make it to the point when railroads were deregulated. I chose this picture because that's actually a train headed for Bloomington in 1939. And the picture was taken about 10 days before passenger service went away for good. It continued and continues today on the old GM&O line, which is now Amtrak and the Union Pacific. That's from the Washington Street station, which I'm sure most of you remember. And it was taken right about Labor Day weekend in 1960. Lots of things rode the railroad, including horse soldiers. In the Civil War, the United States government had 6 cavalry divisions. I think I've got that right. At the end, they formed a 7th Cavalry Division. And they were still headquartered in the South, and they were transferred to Kansas for a while to help keep the peace out there with Indian problems. And then they went back south. Really found that they weren't too well accepted down there. And eventually were called to go back west to the Northwest to protect construction crews as they built more railroads. General Sturgis was the commanding officer of the 7th Cavalry. Right up there with him was this man. We all know him, don't we? To get from their southern headquarters at Memphis, Tennessee, to Yankton, South Dakota, the 7th Cavalry boarded 3 steamships, riverboats, and rode from Memphis up to Cairo, And there they got on 3 different trains and rode from Cairo through the state of Illinois to Galena. And from there, on other railroads that I don't cover in the book, out to Yankton, South Dakota. A part of the contingent ends up in Minneapolis at Fort Snelling, which became the actual headquarters, the administrative headquarters of the 7th Cavalry. They came through Bloomington in April of 1873. The 8th of April was Mrs. Custer's birthday, and there's still a story around today where Custer was out on his horse early in the pre-dawn hours looking for a bakery so he could buy his wife a box of macaroons. That was her favorite treat. And I think he found them. I don't exactly remember. But in the 7th Cavalry, as in any military outfit, there's some guys who will do anything to get out. This is a sketch from Martin Wyckoff, who was very much involved with this museum right up until the time he passed away about 15 years ago. And this sketch was made of a 7th Cavalry deserter showing up at the Coffee Brothers second-hand store trying to hawk his uniform. And he wants to exchange it for a suit of clothes, civilian clothes, so he can kind of sneak away from the 7th Cavalry. You'll see he's got some people behind him who want to change his mind, and they ended up taking him back with a brand new set of bracelets back to the train. So anyway, the story goes, and it's not true, that the Coffee Brothers went out and founded Coffeeville, Kansas. They didn't. It was somebody else named Coffee, who was from Illinois, but it wasn't these guys. Chapter 5 involves this guy. He's one of a lot of people who ended up being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Aaron Goodfellow was from Springfield, Ohio, came out here with his family in the 1860s. His dad had a farm, he had a farm, his brother had a farm. And one thing he found out was he didn't like farms. So he sold his farm, moved into town, and he lived on 511 East Chestnut Street. One night after a game of croquet, he was walking home from the house at the corner of McLean and Locust. It's still there. And he gets just up around the bend to this spot right here. And 2 mugs come out of the bushes and say, "Put up your hands or I'll shoot." Aaron Goodfellow thought it was a joke, and he tried to take the gun away from one of those guys. They shot him twice, did not rob him, and he made it almost home before he collapsed. I'll give you some perspective of where this is. You remember the old Carmody Flynn funeral home here in town when it was over by Franklin Park? That's this property right here. This is Franklin Park, and that's Vice President Stevenson's house. So we're at the corner, really, just off the corner of McLean and Chestnut. They took him home, and he died that night. The papers were full of how the house is full of friends and family. Not one word about a cop being there, but we imagine the police were there. And a manhunt ensues for these 2 guys, the suspects. 100 and some odd years later, you kind of wonder if they got the right guys. I'm pretty convinced that they did. The guy on the left was Harry Williams. He was never brought to justice for the Goodfellow murder. But he died in prison, and the Bloomington authorities did get to talk to him there. And he said, "Well, Yeah, Patsy's innocent. Patsy's the guy on the right. Patsy was tried for the crime twice and hung once. Both trials were held in Clinton on a change of venue. And that story is in here partly because this was the only legal hanging in the history of McLean County. The Goodfellows had, in addition to farmers, there was one branch of the family. They were all railroaders. There was three or four railroad engineers. And David here recently brought me some documentation of demerits against one of them. And if you remember, if you've been in town a real long time, does anybody remember Goodfellow Funeral Home? Okay. We have one old man right over here whom I went to school with, so I mean, he's not that old, but yes. And today it's Calvert Metzler. That's the evolution of it. So they had pardon?
They're all Calvert Metzler, or Calvert anyway, but the second name is the one that distinguishes.
Yes, it was billed as Metzler in 1958, and Calvert took it over. They're not all Calvert, they're still Beck. Nobody gets killed in the next chapter. There was a real wacky guy, a real downtown character. You want to find real characters in town, always go to the business district. That's where you find them. Ran a hotel in town called Waite's New Hotel. And he was given to shenanigans and publicity stunts. One night in 1879, he decides he's going to throw a big banquet for all the fat men in town that he can find. And his hotel is Waite's New Hotel. It's there on the right. And he invites any man who weighs 225 pounds or more. Now, I qualify. Lots of other guys qualify too, and they're nowhere near fat, but this is 2023. Back then, most of these guys had that 225 pounds compressed into a 5'7" frame. So they come across looking as fat men, even if they weren't fat. Maybe they were hale and hearty. Maybe they were farm boy strong. But so he has this banquet, invites all the press, and they end up having a gay old time the night before Thanksgiving. Ostensibly, the reason they gave for that was, well, we want to see if the recent election results impacted the appetites of fat people. Fat chance of that. These are some of the people who attended. Lawrence was a magistrate here in town. Leland was Moses Leland. He owned the Leader newspaper. And of course now we have Leland Street. Dr. Barnes came to town as a physician, was the postmaster for a long time until he died. And Towanda Barnes Road has nothing to do with it. Lots of Barneses. Towanda Barnes Road is Calvin Barnes, completely different family. Judge McLean there on the lower left, we have McLean Street, of course. He owned a lot of land out there. Charles Lander was a horse trader. And David Van Dola, you all know where Lexington is. You ever drive into Lexington coming off of I-55, and right as you come to the edge of town, there's this big mansion. You know the one I'm talking about? Big house. He built it. And he built it as a bribe to his wife, who was about to leave him. He says, if I build you a big house, he was never there. He was always out horse trading. Will you stay if I build you a nice big house? And she said, maybe. He did, and she did. The hotel where this happened was, it's occupied by the site's occupied now by the Major Butler parking lot. And to familiarize yourself with the picture, if you don't recognize it, on the right, that's the Coliseum. In the middle is 200 West Front, the old Champion West building. And on the left is the old Montgomery Ward's building. The hotel was actually up at the corner of Madison and Front Streets. But it made a great picture there, using the sign as a landmark. Echoes of Purple and Gold is actually the title of the next chapter, and I thought it would make a good book. I'd been exposed to the use of the name Echoes before. When I was in college, one of the local TV stations in Columbus did a series with programs with championship football players called Echoes of Scarlet and Gray. So I thought, gee, that's impressive. The show was dull, but the title was impressive. Then in 1990, when the University of Illinois had their 100th anniversary of football, I suggested to my sports guy, who was a guy living here in Bloomington, if any of you know Dan Swaney, let's do a bunch of pieces called Echoes of Orange and Blue, and we'll tell the Illinois football story. And he liked the idea, and he was far better at it, putting it together than I was, so I pretty well stayed out of it. But he put together something that won statewide awards. Was really good. I wish I could show it to you right now. So when it came time to tell this story of Echoes of Purple and Gold, I chose that title. Okay, so from that haunting cover, we look at the same scene before daylight, and we're at Angler's Lake. Angler's Lake is a former tile pit. This is the southeast corner of town at the foot of Vale Street, just south of Lincoln and a little to the west of Mercer. You see a sign that says Anglers Lake Road off of Route 150, Hannah Street, or Morrissey Drive. It really doesn't take you back to the real Anglers Lake. There's a borrow pit right next to the sign, but that's not Anglers Lake. So, on the 26th of June in 1889, 3 young men decided they'd go for a dip after supper. They came to Anglers Lake and began swimming. Now, all 3 of them were said to be decent swimmers, but one of the boys, James Murray, took a cramp, and he went down in the middle of the lake. They looked for him for most of the night. They didn't find him for about 8 hours. The fire department had a ladder unit out there, and there were bonfires and torches along the shore and everything. And finally, they found this kid. And it caused such a ruckus then because the pond was one of Napoleon Hafer's ponds. Napoleon Hafer had ponds all over the south end, which were used for tile and they were used for brick making. And the reason they were concentrated in the south end was that's where the best soil was for them to bake in the kilns. So they were dangerous places. And there was not one drowning that night, there were 2. The other one, Henry Sebring, whose memorial you see on the right, drowned in what I think is Holiday Lake. The news accounts all say, well, it's about half a mile away. And that's about the best we can get. So, and he fought with a kid that was trying to save him, and the kid ended up trying to save himself, and as a result, Henry, who couldn't swim and had stepped in a hole, drowned. One thing that I put in the book that nobody, to my knowledge, has ever looked up before, how many drownings were there in these Hafer ponds? And over the years, I came up with a dozen of them, 12 or 15. And it's really grim reading. It continued well into the 20th century. The last one was a drowning at Anglers Club in 1958. Previous to that was an alleged drowning, if you know where Tri Lakes is, off of South Bunn Street. Well, and a couple of yahoos got into a fist fight there, and one threw the other into the water, and nobody's paying too much attention. And they ended up looking for a body for days, couldn't find it. Several months later, this guy staggers into the police station and says, "I hear you're looking for me for murder." And they said, "What's your name?" And he told them. And the police didn't know quite how to take it because this is the guy that supposedly drowned. And he thought he had drowned the other guy, the guy he was fighting with, and went into hiding. Alcohol was involved. Birthplace of Purple and Gold. That's the old Bloomington High School building as it stood on Monroe and Oak Streets. It's the back lot of the fire headquarters now. Stands to the back of the fire property. The building's gone. In 1890, Donald Murray's classmates voted purple and gold as their class colors. They voted for those colors because purple and gold appeared on a certain pansy, which was this boy's favorite flower. So as a tribute to him, they chose purple and gold as their class colors. 3 years later, they held a school-wide election. What shall we do for school colors? Well, let's have an election. And they put purple and gold up with several other combinations. And purple and gold came out the winner by a wide margin. And it was declared that purple and gold will be worn at all school baseball games and all school football games. They didn't have much else for sports back then. This building became Edwards School until 1903, when Edwards School was rebuilt out on West Market Street. Of course, that building is down now too, and Mount Pisgah Baptist Church is there, along with a branch of the Mid-Illini Credit Union, which has just changed names. Okay, this wasn't inspired by the Pantagraph, but this is inspired by just me hanging out with somebody who mentioned the Ford Woods grain elevator. And I said I'd never heard of it. And let me backtrack a little bit. The Pantagraph helped me crack the mystery. This guy is Ford Woods. He was a workaholic, born in a place called Albion, Illinois, went to work for the railroad in Effingham, and ended up in Indianapolis and then in Springfield, Ohio, running his own railroad in the 1870s. And the parent corporation, the Big Four Railroad, was so impressed with him, they brought him back to Indianapolis and made him a general freight agent of what became the Peoria and Eastern, which ran through here from Bloomington to Mackinac to Tremont and Pekin and Peoria, and then down through Leroy, Farmer City, and eventually to Champaign and Indianapolis. And they named a siding after him. That was a big deal then. It was a big deal until the 15th of June of 1936, when the whole shebang burned down. So, about 30 years later is when I came in, and I told the man who was telling me the story, I never heard of it. And I kind of tucked it back in my storehouse of useless knowledge Like, you can come in, we got lots of chairs. Everybody's welcome. Okay, we won't try that again. When I finally was able to piece the story together, and I really found the man to be very interesting. I mean, who knows who a freight agent is now? But in Indianapolis, this guy was a rock star. He was a philanthropist. He was a gold prospector. He was the subject of cartoons in a book. He got his picture in the paper when he died, at a time when nobody got their picture in the paper when he died. And just said, yeah, you better write something about him. That's how the Fort Woods site looked in 1915. The railroad was pretty well abandoned by then. That's a county road that crosses Interstate 74 a quarter mile to the south. And as you head toward Leroy on 74, you can see off in the distance a substation for the power company. And it's up there on the bank to the north, and that's Fort Woods. Now, if you're from Leroy, you call it Fort Wood, and nobody knows why they call it Fort Wood. That's why. So one afternoon, I was just merrily tripping through the paper working on my column, and I came across this headline. This piqued my interest. This was a 1963 paper. When it came out, I was a junior or senior in high school. My friend there had just graduated. He was on his way to Lambeth College in Tennessee. And so I decided I'd do some looking in on that for this book. And the Titanic survivor was the lady on the right, Del Riggs. And Del Riggs was just a fantastic achiever. She was from a Hudson family. They were well-bred. They were educators. They were farmers. They had debaters in the family. Really a neat family. She married John Riggs from Saybrook, Illinois. The Riggs family, they were really a neat family too. They were farmers from Kentucky. They were, when they built their farmhouse, they didn't build it just for the family. They made sure they had room for the Circuit Methodist preacher who came through town. They got into a mercantile there in town, selling merchandise. They owned the bank until it went under one Christmas Eve. Together, they made a pretty dynamic couple. And they eventually ended up in Bloomington. Now, I'm going to walk out of the picture for just a minute. Sorry. Mr. Riggs had the New York store, which stood right where that building is right now. And he had it until the 19th of June, 1900. What happened then? Yeah, big one. He was the manager of the store. And that was quite a traumatic thing for all of Bloomington. There's still some untold stories, maybe in another book. But the New York store burned down. After that, he never worked again. I've been trying to follow the money. But a time after that, he and Mrs. Riggs, Lilladell, came into a lot of money. I don't know if it's insurance money from the business, I don't know if it's inherited money, but they came into a lot of money and they bought a big farm down towards Olney, Illinois. And they maintained a house on North Main for a while and then moved to the farm. He eventually died of brain injuries in 1912. It's about 5 months after the Titanic sank. They were nowhere near the Titanic. But they were on this boat. That's the USS Columbia. It's a unique boat in that it's the first boat that was ever outfitted with its own electric power plant. Thomas Edison and his own crew installed the electric lights on the USS Columbia. In 1907, the Columbia was making coastal runs between San Francisco and Portland, Oregon. The Riggs, who were celebrating the wedding anniversary, were on the boat one night making that trip when the boat sailed into a fog bank, and so did another ship loaded with lumber. Neither captain said, "Let's reduce speed since we can't see where we're going." They counted on foghorns and everything. A collision resulted. The Columbia sank, and to this day has not been found. The other ship limped to shore with a lot of survivors. But John and Dell Riggs, this is the ship they were on. John and Dell Riggs were rescued and actually continued their vacation. It's sort of an American Express traveler's check story where they were able to replace all of their cash and everything once they got where they were going and finished out their vacation. Once John died in 1912, Lil threw herself into all kinds of civic endeavors, and she became quite a wheel in the DAR. She was state regent, just full of capabilities. I mean, you could do a book about her. A lasting legacy can be found right outside the front door. We've all seen these all over the central Illinois. Abraham Lincoln rode this way on the 8th Judicial Circuit. And they're put up all over the place where Abe once rode. That one is right in front of this building. She was behind that. She made it happen. We got 2 more chapters, and then I'm going to shut up and let you talk. You won't find this picture in the book because the picture just didn't reproduce well enough, but that's a 2-year-old girl on crutches. It happened in Atlanta, Illinois, 1903, and Gertrude was playing on the tracks. She wasn't supposed to be, but her sister, who was watching her at the time, lost track of her. The train from Peoria, the engineer saw her, but he couldn't stop the train in time as he rounded a curve and just mangled her to pieces. She was the youngest in the family that included a couple of sisters and her brother and her parents. They were farm people from Ohio. Her dad was a laborer at the lumber yard nearby. And they sued the railroad and settled for $12,000. So, anyway, but this girl was nothing if she wasn't attitude. And nobody ever told her she couldn't do anything. 1931, she married the guy on the left. He's a radio star named Al Cameron, and he and the guy on the right, Peter Bonsema, had a radio show from Detroit. And I don't know how they came into each other's lives. I've been trying to find, but they got married in Beloit, Wisconsin, where little Gertrude had a sister living. Correction. She didn't live in Beloit, but she lived nearby. Anyway, the marriage lasted about a year. Really wasn't, it's just one of those matches that wasn't meant to be. She comes back to Bloomington, and a strange thing takes place in the family. She's gone from the youngest person and crippled to still being crippled. She's wearing a prosthetic leg now. She's got her own house on East Taylor Street. And she has gone from being the most dependent one in the family to the one everybody else counts on. And her mother, her brother, her father, and one of her sisters all end up living with her. And one by one, except for the sister who was already in Wisconsin, one by one, they all die there. House is still standing. Gertrude ended up with a lot of jobs. This is from 1949 when she was secretary at East Lawn Cemetery. And she loved the job, it loved her. And she ended up, when she retired, she moved to Wisconsin with her sister. And there she passed away in the mid-1970s. So she's one of the few people in the book that you and I could have met as adults. And I thought for that reason, and for her plucky attitude, she's got to be in the book. Anybody know him? Oh, come on. Close. Buffalo Jones. Charles Buffalo Jones. Probably born west of here in Tazewell County, although some accounts say McLean County. One of three really famous men who grew up in Hudson, Illinois, attended Wesleyan, went west, was a buffalo hunter. Later became the savior of the buffalo instead of killing off the whole brand. Spent every dime he had on a ranch and importing buffalo and breeding them. That's why he's called Buffalo Jones. He went broke. Well, he had a friend, Mark Twain, and Mark Twain was making a fortune on the lecture circuit. Buffalo Jones decided, I'll do that too. So he gets booked for a few talks, and the story picks up in New York City in 1907, where he's sitting in his dressing room, mad as hell. It's in the book. I even wrote that. It's one of the four times I use any kind of profanity in the book. And he had just been booed off the stage by New York hecklers. I mean, I can't imagine a tougher crowd unless it's maybe a bunch of Eagles fans at a football game. But so while he's sitting there brooding, like, I'll get even with every one of them, I will. While he's sitting there brooding, there's a knock at the door. It's the dentist. Not just any dentist. So, I'm sure he said something like, look, no, it's not the right time for a root canal, go away. So no, I was in the audience and I was listening to your stories. And I'm really interested. And I want to go west, and I want to go fishing out there, and I want to go hunting. I want to see what you were talking about. I want to meet the people. And I want to write books about it. He said, oh, really? So, well, you're eventually going to have to do something about your name because it sounds like a girl's name. And maybe something a little more distinctive. He said, well, we did have the Old English spelling of my name. So these two made an unlikely pair. And they did go west together, thanks to Charles Buffalo Jones and Zane Grey tagging along. And Zane Grey wrote all those books. I've read some of them. And some of those books became movies. And some of those movies became The Late Show. Others became Zane Grey Theater in the early days of television in the 1950s. And the Zane Grey estate is still alive today. Zane is really quite a family name. I lived east of here several hundred miles for a long time. And we have Ebenezer Zane, who opened up Ohio with the building of Zane's Trace, which became US 40, which became Interstate 70. We have Zanesville, Ohio, where a lot of Bloomington settlers came from eventually. I even took my wife there on our honeymoon 10 years ago. So we have a lot of connection to Zane here. There's no evidence that Zane Grey ever showed up here, but Zane Grey had family here. This is from the Fremont Cemetery, which is east of McLean, just a couple of hundred yards inside McLean County. And he has blood relatives buried there. There's his great aunt, Cynthia Zane Nichols, who was married to Amos Nichols. And they're here in the county, but I cannot find any evidence that Zane Grey ever, regarded them as close or sent them a telegram or a Christmas gifts or anything like that. But I can tell you this. Mr. Thomas and I have a close personal friend who mows that cemetery to this day. He does. So anyway, that's kind of an overview of the weird stories I picked out for this book. There are other weird stories out there. And I want to tell you that I think I learned a few things from this book aside from the cold hard facts. One, ordinary people do extraordinary things. You only have to look for them. And inside every picture, whether it's a word picture or an image, like the cover of that book, there's another picture, a better one, trying to get out somehow. Also, if I can write a book, there are so many other people who never thought they could even try it, who can write a better one than I did. And if you're even thinking about it, I encourage you to go ahead and try it. I mean, at the end of the day, all you've got to lose is maybe a couple of reams of paper, a couple of ballpoint pens, and maybe some legal pads where you made your notes. So I'm talked out, at least from giving a lecture. I debated shortening the presentation a little bit just because it's long. I know you joined me in wishing that I had. But let's have your questions. Now, Maria will go around with a mic, and we've got a runner. It's okay. To be heard, the mic's going to have to be in front of your face, Mike.
And remember, it's being live streamed.
Yeah, well, I can't hear, so I understand. How long did it take you to write this book, Jack?
That's kind of a hard answer because a lot of these articles appeared first as magazine articles. And once I got serious about them and committed to writing them, it probably took me about 3 years. That meant stripping down every article and looking to see where I could add more information, pertinent information. And it first went to a publisher 2020, early 2020, which is just the wrong time to do anything.
Yeah.
But here I was trying, with my hat in my hand, trying to get a book out. Yes, sir.
Did you look into stories which you thought was fascinating and had to reject them because there was no truth to them at all when you were looking for the various people?
Not that I can remember. There are some stories I have written that do quote rumors, and I do my best to say what's true and what's not. Just so you have some kind of a compass going forward.
I can talk loud enough without a microphone, I think.
It's for the live stream.
Well, apparently she doesn't, so.
But there we go. I'd like to know a little bit about the history of the new Bloomington High School because I recall that was some Davis land, but I don't know how that was acquired or why it was acquired in that capacity. And then obviously the other thing is, have you been to, in my era, the old junior high school building today? That's quite a renovation that's been done to the high school number 2.
The school board acquired that land in 1946 or 47 for the purpose of a high school. The ground was broken, I think, in 1958, and 57 or 58, and it opened in the fall of 1959, September, and which left guys like Mike and me finishing our junior high school career, which began at Washington Junior High, at the junior high downtown. It was Davis land at one time. The judge probably owned it. He owned an awful lot of land on the east side, including what is now Bloomington Country Club. But at the time they acquired it, it had passed to his son George. And I believe, too, that there was a golf course on the site at one time. You have to read the history book of Bloomington Country Club to get that. It started, I believe, at the site of Bloomington Junior High, went down to State Farm Park for a year or two, and then out to where it is now, and became a 9-hole course, and eventually 18. Does that answer your question? I can expand a little bit. You said high school number 1.
Was the swimming pool there when constructed?
Yes. The building in front of the swimming pool was not. It was built about 30 years ago, I think. And that's the Robert Frank Center, the athletic center. But yes, and that won statewide awards for its design. It's, it would be a knockout today if that shoebox weren't in front of it. Excuse me. But, yeah. but there was much more than just these two and this high school too. In between, there was another high school which stood where Jefferson School, now the District 87 building, stood. And it was there until 1932 when it burned down. And the high school moved out of there and over to Washington Street in 1917. And prior to that, they met in the Franklin School building, and not this building, not the most recent building that you might remember as Franklin School, but the predecessor. And they also met in a school building that stood on East Taylor Street, where there are now 3 mint-colored, pastel-colored houses. And those houses are built partly with timbers from that school building.
Mr. Keefe, how did you find your publisher?
Again, I
How
apologize.
did you find your publisher?
Online. Now, they do run a small schedule of national television ads, and I may have seen one of those ads. But I perused Writer's Guide, which is a book about yay thick, comes out about once a year. I perused that. I talked to other authors who had different luck, and the one I really wanted an Illinois publisher, and it just wasn't going to happen. The one I really wanted after the one in Mahomet folded was one in Chicago, which a friend of mine in Morton was using, and he encouraged me to submit to them. So I did, and they wrote back saying, well, gee, thanks. You really need somebody closer to Bloomington than we are. They were publishing Peoria stories, but not Bloomington. And one of those books is called Peoria Stories. So, Larry and Kay, you've been quiet back there.
Just enjoying it very much.
If you ever need to know anything about the restaurant scene in Bloomington, Larry Carius is the man to know. So,
Okay, any more questions? Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us. Jack will be headed downstairs where he will be doing the book signing, so please take your time and make your way downstairs so you can get your own copy. And I also have a wonderful survey that is sitting over there that if you wouldn't mind filling out for the people that are here. We're very interested in how people are hearing about our events. So if you have some time and wouldn't mind filling that out, we would really appreciate it at the museum. But thank you all for coming, and let's give Jack a hand.